All right, guys, welcome back. So today, let's talk about the winter solstice. So winter solstice is December 21st on the solar calendar. December 21st of 2020 is expected to be a very interesting situation happening. But I want to talk about two things in one here. So the first thing would definitely be that, today's December 20th, so tomorrow's December 21st, and that would mark the winter solstice. And the second thing that I want to talk about is kind of, I first want to talk about how the winter solstice is kind of like how it's kind of evolved maybe from what it was to where it is now, if you're looking at Western culture and American society, and then also kind of the second topic would be kind of what people are saying about this COVID December 21st winter solstice 2020 as being the end of the world date according to the Mayan calendar. And so so all that being said, so I would say one thing to keep in mind is that there are multiple types of calendars in different cultures. It kind of just depends like what you're following. In the US, most people, at least our government acknowledges and honors the solar calendar. And so, we kind of tend to follow that calendar. We have certain months: January, February, March, April, blah, 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 12 months. Most of them have approximately 30 days. You get a leap year here and there. I don't remember how often. Is it every 4 years? I could be wrong. In February, that's the shortest month, and then every so often you add a day, and then you can use your little knuckle counting thing that starting from the first knuckle, as if that was the first month, it would have 31 days, and then use the little, I don't know what you call it, the space between your knuckles. So everything between the knuckles is less than 31 days. And then it kind of transfers over to the second hand, where you kind of have that part where there's like 31 days and then 31 days again in the next month. And so that's kind of like a simple trick that people kind of use to remember. And then, so it's all based on a solar cycle, like paying attention to the sun, and us, the earth going around the sun. And then there's a lunar calendar, which, in the US, we get to kind of know that this exists also because we have so many cultures in the US. And so, like, Judaism follows the lunar calendar. A lot of Asian cultures, I know, like, even if you think of something like Chinese New Year or Hmong New Year, they don't celebrate them on January 1st. It's on a different day. And so keeping that in mind, throughout history, not everybody's even followed the same calendar. And even now, people don't all follow the same calendar. But in a way, it kind of depends on who's in charge, because if you have a society like ours, where everyone kind of relies on like, okay, we kind of need to know what time it is and what day it is and what month it is. Like, we really depend on time, in general, dates of things, like if somebody says, like, for example, my friends want to go and do some exercise like at the beach on Tuesday evening, and it's like, okay, you need to know what day Tuesday evening is and what time to get there. You know what I mean? Like, you can't just not know, like we kind of need to know days and times and months and all these things so that we can actually follow the schedules that our society makes us follow. And something that I found really funny, I think it was the movie Wonder Woman. This isn't really a spoiler, but it was just kind of like a funny comment that, like, I think the main character had like a watch or something. I can't remember. I was watching this on a plane a long time ago. And basically he had a watch and he meets the lady and she's just like, oh, so you let that thing dictate, like, kind of like what you do. It tells you, you let that thing tell you what to do throughout your days, kind of like that. Like in their society, they didn't have anything like that. There was like a watch. There was like, oh, it's noon, it's time to eat lunch or whatever. It was like, you kind of just, I don't know how they did it, but they did things differently. But it's like, yeah, I can't even imagine not having access to what time it is or knowing what day it is. I mean, we very much depend on having a clock. I mean, you can have an internal clock, and I'd say I fall asleep, wake up wake up nearly the same time every day, but I don't fall asleep the same time. I probably eat near the same times, relatively speaking. But yeah, things like that, where it's like, if I didn't have a clock to tell me when to wake up, when to start getting ready, when to actually log into work, when to stop working, I'd basically just have to look at the sun. And I can do that. But it's like, because the time changes too, and like the sun goes down earlier and earlier than later. And so today it's going down still, like tomorrow's going to go down. It's going to go down earlier than any other day this year. And then if we survive that day, then it's going to keep going down, obviously, every night, but it'll go down at a later and later time till when we get to summer and it's like daytime all day and most of the night. It's like even after dinner, it's still sunlight out in the summer. So whereas now most people get off work and the sun's already down. So yeah, so that's just my little spiel on that. But so if we're looking at, just this time of year in history, right? Some major things are kind of coming up now. They kind of overlap with what you see in history. And so one thing we've seen in history is, when you look at religions, and especially, I focus a lot on the Christian religion because I have so much background in it that it just makes sense to kind of start with what I know. And a lot of other religions, I know things about them, but it takes so much studying and delving into it. These thousands of year old, like religions and teachings and texts that I have to read the English versions for most things. And even if I can read some other languages, like, I don't even know what it is, most of it. And so, it's like, am I really going to look at a dictionary for every single thing? But I would say that's a helpful skill to have, and it's tedious, but I'd say if there's something you want to learn and want to know, it's always good to kind of look it up that way. But yeah, so let's talk about this time of year, because right now, we just passed Hanukkah. So Hanukkah ended couple days ago, I think December 19th-ish, I don't know, it ended like Thursday or Friday this week, and then it's gonna be Christmas on Friday, and then it's Sunday now. The winter solstice is gonna be Monday. And so if you look at history, Hanukkah isn't even as old as, the winter solstice has been the winter solstice since, I guess since the humans decided that's what they wanted to call it. But that was also a celebration, like a week-long celebration, including the winter solstice, was Saturnalia. And so that is a Roman pagan festival that goes back, I don't know how long, like before Jesus, and it goes back before the Maccabean revolt, which was kind of what led to Hanukkah. And so it went back before all of that. The Romans were already doing this. The pagans were already celebrating Saturnalia, which was like a week-long feast. And so there's a lot of stuff that you still see. There's like so many combinations of things that you still see, which is so interesting to me. I'm not knocking it. I'm just saying it's interesting that, you can span over 2,000, close to like 2,500, more than 2,500 years, nearly 3,000 or maybe more. I don't know how many more, but at least 2,500-ish years, if not closer to 3,000 or more, of traditions that we still see coming up, but most people don't even know what it's for, right? And so most of the time, if you ask like your typical classic American, they know, okay, December 25th isn't Jesus' birthday. He wasn't born on December 25th. They didn't even use the same calendar of December, having December on it. And so, yeah, so December 25th wasn't even a thing, for Jesus necessarily. But the interesting part is, Jesus' culture did overlap with Roman culture, with Greek culture, with, Egyptian culture, with all sorts of different cultures. When you think of it, they're so different from one another too. Like, of course there's overlap everywhere, but they're so different. If you think now of like, Romans, or, Italians, whatever, of Greek people from Greece, if you think of people from Egypt, if you think of people from Israel, they're not the same, cultures. They're so different, and their cultures have so much deep-rooted ancient stuff, even in like written history, right? And so that's an interesting thing, is that they all have these written histories that are old and go so far back, and this even predates Christianity. Like, Christianity didn't even exist until, Jesus started getting followers of the way, which is what it was called. And they were still Jewish then. They were still Jews practicing Judaism in a way that was a different method. So, a lot of the people didn't really have the same connection to the commandments as I would call them like the classic Jews of that time. They didn't really have the same connections to the law. Some of the people that were followers were people that were not considered clean enough to be a part of that temple. So they weren't actually allowed to participate officially in becoming ritually clean. And like, people in that ancient Jewish society weren't really even allowed. If you were religious and clean, you weren't really allowed to associate with all these other people who weren't clean. You couldn't associate with Gentiles. You couldn't associate with people with certain diseases or problems or, taboos of the culture that weren't acceptable, or things that weren't like that the Torah, that the law of Moses, the law said, or the law that was given to Moses said, about how to, that you have to do this or have to do that. You couldn't even partake in the parts where you were supposed to be cleansed. And so because you couldn't officially be cleansed, you couldn't officially do the other stuff that the other Jewish people in the society were doing. So you were kind of like, there was like another part of that society in Jesus' day it was kind of like the outcast people, and a lot of them were the ones that were joining. And there was a certain point, there were points in the Bible where you see like the Pharisees and the Sadducees, these religious leaders, these people from the temple, these people that were actually participating in the temple system that would come and listen to him talk, and they had standing in the community, but they weren't the other Jews that were the typical type of person that would kind of listen to the message, but also like, because the commandments were a burden, and the commandments around the commandments, because they would make extra commandments to keep you from breaking the basic commandment. So it's like, okay, remember the seventh day, remember the Sabbath, keep it holy, you shouldn't do any work, your animals aren't supposed to be working, your man and maid servants aren't supposed to be working, you can't buy and sell things. But in order to not do that, it's like now we have to make a rule so that let's take it a little further. So it's like, maybe if sundown is at 5 p.m., let's start at 4 p.m. just to be sure that we don't break the 5 p.m. It's like, let's start things earlier. Let's create a barrier or like a fence around that actual commandment, so you can't even get to the fence, so that you can't break the commandment. And so it would become so burdensome. And you know how humans are. They manipulate everything. So, people have evil agendas, and especially sometimes people in power have evil agendas, and they're greedy, and they just want to have power and control. And one way to control people is through religion. Not always, but definitely it happens. So, yeah, I'm kind of getting off topic, but basically, if you're just looking at general society with this time of year, the end of December, we still have a lot of practices that I want to talk about, things that we do now that come from these ancient cultures. So Saturnalia is this week-long festival that is, and I could be wrong with some of this, but it's around the time of the winter solstice, right? So near December 21st, there's like a week celebration to the god of Saturn, and the sun is what gives you that information. It tells you that it's that time of year. It's the shortest amount of daylight in the whole year. And in American culture, we don't really do anything with it. We just say, oh, it's the winter solstice, it's going to be the shortest day. And that's basically where we leave it, right? But back then, if you even look in like ancient Roman culture, they would have like this whole week long of festival, right? And so some things that you would still see now, just one major thing would be the Christmas tree. Another thing that you might see is like how people like to eat like a ham, or different things like that, like parties and things that you still kind of see those lights, fires, things like that we kind of still see these things around us. But so if you look in the Bible, you see a lot of times there's this phrase or, this term called Asherah or Asherim. And or I guess it's kind of translated into sacred poles to some extent. People use that word, and it's almost like Let me look this up, because I want to say it's almost like a totem pole. Let me see. So if I look this up, yeah. So in Canaanite religious places, and also, yeah, pagans. And so it symbolized the goddess Asherah, right? And so people would have these in high places. They say it's a sacred wooden post, pole, pillar, but in that time, like during certain times of history, it was like a fir tree. You know, they would take the I guess you would call it like a trunk of the tree, or even the whole tree, and put it in the house during this time of year. Like, it was part of celebrating Saturnalia. You would take this tree, this sacred pole, as a representation of this goddess and put it in your house. I don't know all the details anymore of what went into that, but there was definitely that. And I don't know what day it happened on or any of that. And then there was also a time period during Saturnalia where they would sacrifice a pig at the temple of Saturn. And so they would have this pig, they would sacrifice it. You know, there were feasts and things like this going on. So if you think about that background, right? If you think about that background, and then you think about the Jewish background, right? So if you're overlapping these cultures during a time period at, what time is this? So if you say I think the date was 336 BC, or for those of you who prefer BCE, but I just say BC. So, so before the Common Era, or before Christ, or whatever you want to call it, we say Christ was on Earth at this point approximately 2020 years ago. And then so at about 336 or so years before the time period when Christ was on Earth, and he was only on Earth for 30 some odd years. So about 336 years before he was on Earth. I don't know if that's before his birth or before his death, or whatever that 30 something year period was. Less than 40 years, but more, I don't know if it was more than 29, less than 40 years. Whatever that time period was, about 336 years ago, that is the time when the Romans and the pagan culture started to take over in Jerusalem. And so they took over based on their ruler, who was Antiochus Epiphanes. He was their leader, and he led them into battle, and they basically destroyed the temple in Jerusalem, and they sacrificed a pig on the altar, and they were celebrating Saturnalia. They did that during this time of year. And then I don't remember what year that happened, but there was another time that after that period happened, later on, the Jews, the Maccabees that were Jewish, decided that, you know, they wanted their religion back, they wanted their culture back, they wanted things back to the Jewish way. And so basically there was the pagan takeover during that time, and they changed all of the Jewish holidays that had been going on since or holy days or feast days that were going on since Moses' time. They changed all those days so that, you know, they were no longer even following the lunar calendar. They're like, now we're following the solar calendar, and we're following these different practices. So they were no longer allowed to really be following their Jewish practices. They had to follow these other practices, right? These pagan practices, because the pagans were the ones in rule at that time. And then the Maccabean revolt happened when the Jews decided they wanted their culture back. So because the pig was sacrificed on the altar, they weren't allowed to actually like use the temple for worship. Like, it was basically desecrated, right? And that's what some people call the abomination of desolation. Was during Saturnalia, when that pig was sacrificed on the altar, which was the most holy place to the Jews, they could no longer do what they needed to do, because everything revolved around this temple. Like, you had to use the temple. I don't know time period wise if people were still sacrificing, if people were still I don't really know, because there was a time when people eventually stopped sacrificing, and I can't remember when that was, but Jews weren't, there was a certain, you had to basically do certain ritual cleansings, you had to do certain sacrificing, and all these things happened in certain locations, and it had to happen in certain holy locations. You couldn't just do this like any old place, right? And so they weren't able to fully be in their own eyes committed to God, because they couldn't practice their own religion fully and do the commandments that they were told to do, because they couldn't use the temple. And so the Maccabeans, when they revolted, they basically rededicated the temple, and that's where Hanukkah comes from, is commemorating the rededication of the temple, so that the Jews had back their religion. And there's a whole story, there's like a whole story about it in the book of Maccabees. I don't know how many Maccabees there are in the Apocrypha, but in the book of Maccabees, you can find the whole story of the Maccabean revolt. And when they revolted, they basically got their practices, their religion, their culture back. But if you think of it, it all happened during Saturnalia. So there's like 3 different layers of Saturnalia happening simultaneously. There's the pagan layer of Saturnalia, which is older than the Jewish and the Christian one. The Jewish Hanukkah happens technically then it happened during Saturnalia, but it's not always during Saturnalia, that week period of Saturnalia, because they follow the lunar calendar. But the first Hanukkah, when they rededicated the temple, that was during Saturnalia. When they rededicated, and then basically they just celebrate it every year during their lunar calendar time. And so there's a way to kind of overlap the calendars, but it's really confusing because like it changes every year. And so basically Hanukkah starts on the 9th of Kislev. I don't know if it's pronounced Kislev or Kislev, but the 9th of Kislev, Hanukkah starts. And that is a different day in December, depending on what the lunar calendar is doing. But it's usually in December, November-ish. But the solar calendar, the one that we follow, is always on the same, like, so basically we have the same date. Every day it's the same date. And they have the same date too. So the 9th of Kislev is always the 9th of Kislev. But it's not always going to be December 25th or December 21st or December 20 whatever. Like, it's not always going to be the same. But yeah, so I hope that makes sense. So basically there was the pagan holiday that was going on for like the longest time, and then in like 330 BC something, that's when the temple was, that whole abomination of desolation, the pagans did that to the Jewish temple. And then during the next, so we haven't even talked about Christmas yet. So basically, if you think of Christmas, so Christmas is December 25th, right? And so Antiochus Epiphanes and, the rulers that came after him, a lot of leaders really like this idea of like, let's blend all of our cultures so we'll all be happy. And so they basically took the idea that, I don't know if it was Antiochus Epiphanes or if it was somebody later, but they took their original Saturnalia week festival, and then they put on top of that, that Hanukkah is near that same time. And then if you see in the Bible, in the book of John, it talks about Jesus walking in Solomon's, the what was it called? Solomon's porch or Solomon's colonnade or whatever they call it, the part of the temple that was original, that hadn't been secularized or paganized, the part of the temple that was rededicated but was still being kept according to Jewish custom. That part of the temple, it just has like a little blurb about it in the book of John, where it says that Jesus was walking during, it was winter, it was the time of, there are multiple words for it. So some Bibles will say Hanukkah, some Bibles will say the Festival of Lights. They use words differently, like the words festival and feast are used kind of interchangeably. So they'll say like Festival of Lights or Feast of Lights or the Festival of Rededication. Those are all Hanukkah, basically. So if you see that passage in John where it talks about Hanukkah, it just basically says that it was during that time and Jesus was at the temple. And so you can kind of assume, I don't know if he was celebrating it or part of the commemoration, the commemoration of the revolt of the Maccabees and all this kind of stuff, when they rededicated the temple. I don't know if he was part of celebrating it or if he was just there, or if he was just happened to be in the temple, but, yeah. So that's basically what I would say is sorry, I got a little weirded out because the neighbor keeps like looking at my car. Yeah, so basically what you see is Jesus, and they mention this temple, that he's there, and it's during Hanukkah. That's kind of just basically what it mentions. And the disciples come up to Jesus and they're like, just tell us, just be straight up with us. Are you the Son of God? Like, are you the Messiah? Are you Christ? Like, tell us, And of course, Jesus, how he always did, he didn't just say, oh yeah, that's me, or oh no, he would always give these long explanations that were just so like out there. And so, so basically that was a time when eventually, some religious leaders and religious Jews heard him, and they were like, oh, like he's saying that he's God and we're going to kill him or arrest him because he's doing all these things that are blasphemous according to us. And, he almost got himself arrested and killed during that time. During Hanukkah, he was able to escape. And again, Hanukkah's like, I think Hanukkah's 8 days, right? Saturnalia is 7 days, and Christmas is 1 day. A lot of people celebrate Christmas Eve and Christmas. I think a lot of people would consider the night before Christmas to actually be like a holiday in a way. Like, if somebody's like, it's one thing to work Christmas Eve in the daytime. It's another thing if somebody's like, you gotta work Christmas Eve night. I mean, that's kind of pushing it. It's almost like somebody telling you have to work the morning of Thanksgiving. It's like, seems like too close to inside the holiday. But yeah, I just find that interesting, that there's this whole overlapping. And so during those times, like, you started to see, once there were actually Christians, the people that were following the way, people that were following Jesus, for the first people that seemed to have kind of come upon him were the religious Jews, the Jews that were in the society where he was raised, the disciples that he went out and sought, the one disciple that sought him, the people in the community that were also Jewish that became followers. At first, Christianity was a very Jewish religion, and they still followed the Jewish law. They still followed the Jewish customs. They still had the same festivals, feast days, everything. It looked like classic Judaism, just, they weren't following the laws the way that the religious leaders thought that they needed to. But they were following the Torah. They were following the Jewish law. They were following the laws. They just weren't following them the way that the leaders wanted them to be followed. They weren't breaking the commandments. And so Jesus wasn't saying break the commandments or don't do anything. He was just saying, it's not supposed to be such a burden. He said things like, my yoke is easy and my burden is light. And that's kind of a comment that was made by rabbis. They considered, like, it's kind of like, because everything back then, there was a lot of agricultural stuff. So they would put a yoke on the oxen, and that would kind of help them kind of figure out what to do. And it would train them to kind of like till or do whatever kind of work needed to be done to the land. And it would, a yoke basically, according to what I remember, a yoke would take an oxen that didn't know what to do, and they would yoke it or put like this object, wooden or so object, around the neck of one that knew what to do, and then the other one that didn't know what to do. And basically a yoke was basically what they used to train the animal that didn't know how to actually work the land. And then once it got trained, it was able to basically just work, right? Or be of a work tool or something. I don't know what you call it. But if you say that's equivalent, like basically a rabbi was considered to have a yoke, right? So you would be yoked to the rabbi, not literally, like they wouldn't put like a thing on your neck or whatever, but it was like you would follow that rabbi to the T, and you would do and say and do, like you would basically just, this rabbi does this, I do the same thing. I follow what they do. I follow their schedule. I learn what they learn. I eat what they eat. You do what they do, right? And so he was saying, my yoke is easy, my burden is light, meaning, like, you can follow me, but I'm not going to be an asshole. I'm not going to, make it so your life is miserable. I mean, the only thing I can say would be similar would be like nowadays, if you're like if you're like an apprentice or like in a practicum or like an internship, or even if you're just working and you have like a supervisor or a boss or someone in charge of you, and they're a jerk, you're going to notice, right? And you're following these people, and you need them to sign off on stuff. You need them to write you letters of rec. You need them to build your career. You can't just get out of school and start working. Like, you have to have someone to vouch for you. You have to have some sort of in-field experience learning, and that's kind of what that whole process was, right? So when it comes to the laws and Jesus, he wasn't trying to make it a burden, but a lot of times in that society during that time period, those religious leaders tried to make the biggest burdens for the followers, and they hated it, but it was like they believed in it and they had faith, so what else could they do? And if you didn't follow, you couldn't be part of the society. And so it was kind of like, you kind of had to do it. So, and there were rabbis, he was considered an official rabbi. I mean, he went and they referred to him as a rabbi. People in the Bible did. I don't know if everybody did, but, I mean, the Pharisees and the Sadducees knew he was teaching. Yes, they tried to kill him a lot and they wanted him arrested and killed, but I think it was because of the jealousy, because he was taking their followers, and because he was in the right. I mean, he was teaching from compassion, and he taught about love, and he wasn't teaching about like all these hateful things of like, oh, like you can't talk to this person or be around that person, or if this person's reputation isn't up to par, you can't even be seen with this person or eat at their house or anything like that. It's like you have to like basically shun all these other people just to be seen like as okay by the religious leaders. And that's according to them. It's not according to anything else. But they would make it so you had to follow their yoke, which was terrible sounding. And then Jesus had his own. John the Baptist also had his own. He has his own followers and everything too. And he was there before Jesus was even there. So, yeah. So when you think about all that, so fast forward past Jesus a little bit. Jesus gets crucified, unfortunately. I mean, fortunately for us, because people who believe in salvation, I mean, it helps us, but I mean, crucifixion was torture. So I'm not saying that I think it was like a nice thing. They always make it look so like glamorous of like, they always glamorize everything, but it's like, dude, like crucifixion was like, if you even look in, I mean, torture is already bad as it is, like, and I think the word bad doesn't even do it justice, but I mean, torture is already terrible. And so if you take, and there's different levels of terrible torture, and so crucifixion was considered one of the worst in all history of types of torture. And so basically he was basically tortured to death, let's be real. And so that's very sad to think that religious leaders will go to a point, not even kill. I mean, it's one thing, okay, you behead somebody, just get it done, or, some other method that's like quick. Like crucifixion is not quick. It's like a multiple day process of dying. And the process before the crucifixion also, I mean, like, I don't even know how people survive that. And so it's like, it's just, wow. And all for what? Like, it wasn't for any actual crime. It was basically for not following the law and for stepping on their toes, basically, because they were just really, I don't know, man, they were nuts, in my opinion. Like, who does that to somebody? And this was one of their own, like, Jesus learned in the temple. He was a rabbi, and they crucified him. It's kind of like, alongside of people who had committed crimes. He hadn't even committed any crimes, but they decided that he needed to die that way. And so fast forward even past crucifixion, you have, so after the Gospels, you have the book of Acts, and Paul is the leader there. The church of Acts is very interesting. So what you start seeing in the church of Acts is Christians, right? These are Christians that are Jews, but then you start having this Gentile population come in, which Gentile is basically anybody who's not Jewish. I mean, anybody who's not Jewish, you're Gentile. And so Gentiles were now being converted to Christianity. And Gentile would mean you could have been like any form of religion and still been considered a Gentile, right? So there were a lot of pagans that were Gentiles, right? Because they weren't Jewish. They were pagan. So there were a lot of pagans that got converted to the way. They got converted to Christianity. There were Jews that were Christians. There were pagans that were Christians. There were Greeks that were Christians. There were different African groups that were Christians. There were so many different types of Christians at a certain point, and the religion spread so fast. And so if you take that book of Acts, that happened. And then in addition, in the history of Christianity, early Christianity, so there were all these arguments that, okay, the Jews need to stay Jewish and do the Jewish law, and they are believers in Christ. So there was kind of a divide. There were those people, and then there was another group of people that were the people who were Gentiles that were converted into Christianity, and these people basically didn't have to follow Jewish law because they weren't Jewish. So there was this argument of, do we make them follow the Jewish law? Like, they were circumcising like grown people and all this stuff because they were like grown people converting to Christianity, and Jewish law, you have to be circumcised to be Jewish, so you gotta circumcise all these people and all this kind of stuff. And then, there were arguments like, do we need to really do how do they convert? How do we consider a Gentile actually as Christian? And I don't even know if that was the word they used. I don't think that was the word, and I don't know if I remember what the word was. But the way is often a term that's used, is the way. And so I think the term Christians was used as a derogatory term. It actually wasn't it's like calling black people the N-word. It's kind of like, I mean, like, if somebody says that word about something, a person that they're describing, you can kind of assume, oh, they're probably talking about a black person, but you're not, like, okay with it, hopefully, like, if somebody says, like, the N-word, you'll know, okay, they're talking about somebody who's black, but they're not gonna be like, so that's kind of the same way that the word Christian was used. It wasn't, it was a religious slur. It was a prejudice, a word. It was like it was not a good term. And so a lot of people call themselves Christians, and it's very interesting. And I'm not saying people shouldn't. I mean, like, you gotta call yourself something that people are going to understand. But it's very interesting that term was used as a slur. And now it's just like everybody just uses it, right? Talking about reclaiming phrases and words, right? Reclaiming things. But yeah. So take that for example. So yeah, you have the Jews, you have the Christians, you have the Jewish Christians, you have the Gentiles that converted to Christianity. Some of the Gentiles were pagans, and then they became Christian. And then I don't know at what time period this happened, but there was some time period, the Council of Nicaea, when the Jews, there was a point when the Jews that were Christians would still worship at the Jewish temple, but they were just followers of the way. But some of them would still worship at the temple. And then there was a point where they got like excommunicated out of being able to do that. And so then, once they were out of the temples, and then it became like a whole other religion pretty much over time that was just blending all these different cultures, because that's what happens, right? You have a bunch of people from all these different backgrounds following one religion. They're all going to do it in a way that they do it, right? So you have all that happening, and then, you know, the pagans, you know, brought in and I think there was a ruler that came in, that like a Roman ruler who came in and made it so that December 25th was considered the birth of Christ, even though that's during the festival of Saturnalia as a pagan day, as a pagan week festival. So I don't even know if this is making sense. I feel like it's hard for me to explain. It's like jumbled in my head, but yeah, there's kind of like 3 layers overall, right? There's the pagan layer that was old, the Jewish layer that kind of came later, when we're talking about like Saturnalia and all this, and Hanukkah, you know, and then Christmas, you know, of course, if there was no Jesus, no one's even talking about the birth of Jesus until, you know, like, because even during Jesus' life, nobody was celebrating the birth of Jesus. That wasn't like a thing. Christianity, the way that we celebrate Christmas, you know, is different now. And so, you know, you had pagans that would still do their days too. And they would celebrate Saturnalia, and they would bring, you know, the Christmas trees in the houses, and they would do all these gifts and festive things for like a week and things like that. And you have the Jewish culture, the early Christians that were, you know, either pagan or Jewish or whatever the early Christian was. Like, there were multiple types of early Christian, and a lot of them still were following their days. And then rulers came in and made it so people had to follow Christianity with pagan roots too. You know, they were like, okay, Christianity is going to be, you know, we're going to implement all these pagan things. And then they basically pushed Judaism. The culture of Judaism got completely pushed out of Christianity eventually, to a point where, like, it doesn't even look the same. Like, they changed, that same ruler that changed for Christmas to be, or for December 25th to be considered, you know, the birth of Christ and Jesus' birthday, also made it so that, you know, no longer are Christians worshiping, you know, Friday sundown to Saturday sundown on the Jewish Sabbath. Now they're going to services on Sunday, which is, you know, the day of worship. The pagans worshipped on that day. And so it's kind of like, I mean, I'm not saying anything bad about it, but that's just the history of it all. I mean, Sunday church service, Sunday, you know, being the main day of worship, or the festive, the most festive or like congregational day of worship. You can worship any day, any time. I mean, you don't have to have like a whole bunch of people with you, and you don't have to have a whole church. You don't have to have a whole building. So, I think Jesus said in the Bible, or I don't know if it was Jesus, but you know, wherever two or more are gathered, you know, I think it was Jesus. Wherever 2 or more are gathered, there I am also. It's like, you only really need 2 people for it to be considered a worship service. In Jewish culture, you need a minyan, which is, how many people is it? 8 people, maybe? You need more. And so they have, like, Jewish culture still has a davening service in the mornings. A lot of people might do it before work, and they might go into a synagogue to do this, in certain neighborhoods, and they have to get kind of like a head count of who's going to be there, because is the daven, you know, is this morning service going to be, is it going to be a minyan, or is it going to be just like a couple people? It's considered holier to be a minyan or more. But it still counts. I mean, no one's going to say like, oh, your worship didn't count. But, yeah, so I don't know if I have anything else to say about all that, but yeah, that's kind of the main history of how we start doing all this now. But, also taking into account that this time of year, Um, I mean, we also have 2020 and COVID, and so this is like a whole situation that people are really talking about, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that next. I only know what I know, and so I'm not saying I'm any authority on any of this stuff. And some of it, look it up, because I'm terrible with dates and names and all these kind of things. If I'm not like reading it from like a book or something, like a lot of this is coming from my memory today, so I mean my memory is very faulty on all this stuff because I haven't even really been caring about it for like very many years, probably like a decade now. So I've just left it where it was. So yeah, I hope that's interesting. Again, I'm not judgmental about this stuff. I don't care. People worship the way you want to worship. Do what you got to do that makes you happy. If you're not hurting anybody, that's between you and God, if you believe in God, and who am I to tell you anything? But yeah, I mean, it's just interesting. I just find it super interesting that when you look at Christmas today, if you were to ask like the classic American, they would say, hey, yeah, it's Jesus' birthday, December 25th. We get gifts and put a Christmas tree in the house. We put lights on the outside and light a fireplace and put the stockings. And a lot of the things that are done as those customs come from the practices of the week during Saturnalia. And during the winter, when the winter solstice happens, and then that whole week of Saturnalia. So it's kind of like very interesting to me that it's like a lot of people don't know that. A lot of people also don't know where Hanukkah comes from. They're just like, oh, it's a Jewish thing. And then, I don't know how clear it is if Jesus did or did not celebrate Hanukkah. But I mean, they mentioned it in the New Testament. So it was a thing in Jewish society. Then you won't see Hanukkah in the Old Testament. You see it in the Apocrypha. You don't see it in the Old Testament because it hadn't happened yet. And so there was no Hanukkah yet because that, what they called the abomination of desolation hadn't happened to the temple yet. That pig wasn't sacrificed on the altar. The pagans weren't taking over and ruling at that time yet, and so there was no Hanukkah. So Hanukkah is a relatively new holiday, and Christmas basically is like a hybrid version of Saturnalia that it throws some Jesus in there. So it's like, yeah, let's throw Jesus in the middle of this holiday. And then I don't know anyone who practices Saturnalia. I'm sure people do, honestly. I mean, pagans are still around. They still practice their religion. And just because someone's a pagan doesn't mean they're evil. I mean, it's kind of interesting that, like, I was talking about that with some people that, when, like, people almost think that pagan and heathen and, like, are like the same word. It's like that doesn't really mean the same thing. Pagans, it's a culture, pagan is a culture. Paganism is a culture, and they have religious beliefs very tied to nature, very much tied to, the solar calendar, to the sun, to the stars, different parts of the natural environment. And Christianity honestly doesn't really have any holidays of its own. I mean, the birth of Jesus, we don't even celebrate it on the birth of Jesus. We don't really know when that is, but people speculate it's probably near April-ish. And then the crucifixion of Jesus, we celebrate the risen Jesus, when Jesus rose again, for Easter. And some people celebrate, I guess, the whole thing, the crucifixion through the resurrection. But that's the period of Easter, which also is a pagan holiday. Easter has pagan roots to it. But that's kind of all Christians really get is Jesus' birth, Jesus' death, Jesus' resurrection. And a lot of it's kind of like confused in the middle of the pagan traditions on one side and some Jewish traditions on the other side. But there is really no actual like Christian traditions that you see in mainstream American culture. I mean, if you look at Orthodox religions, Orthodox Christians, and a lot of Orthodox Christians, like in Armenian culture and like Syrian, different Orthodox, Greek Orthodox, like different Orthodox Christians, they actually practice a more an older version of Christianity that's probably closer to what would have been happening after the crucifixion of Jesus, like slightly after that. That's probably more what it looked like than the mainstream Christian culture of doing things. I mean, which is fine. I mean, things evolve, but it's just interesting that we're never really taught these things unless you go to like a really religious school or you were raised in a really religious house, or which I was for all of these. And so, or we're raised around a lot of really religious people, which I was also. And so it's like, I've been raised with these things, but I know that outside of the people that I knew from church and home and family, when I would talk to everybody else, like everybody else is mostly just like, nobody knows what's going on with these things. And it's fine, because that's part of American culture too, that, people aren't too concerned with the histories of it. They're just like, we're here now, we're doing this now. This is how we do things. We're not really looking at like where it came from or why we do it this way. This is what Christianity looks like in America, and it's fine. And it doesn't look like this in other religions. I mean, in other countries sometimes. So it's kind of interesting. We have our version of Christmas, our version of, these different holidays, but it doesn't look the same all over the place. So it's just something that I found interesting for this time of year. I just think it's good food for thought. I'm not saying people should like change their religions or like anything, but it's really fun to study. Honestly, it's like really kind of like interesting to study that something that's like 3,000 something years old or maybe older, is still something you literally see in most households, even if they're not religious. I mean, even non-Christians celebrate Christmas and have Christmas trees and things like this. So I just find it interesting that there's certain things that like kind of don't make it a certain distance in history, and then there's other stuff that like just stays. And I wonder why that is. I mean, I think some of the fun stuff, or the stuff that's like people can grasp things that they can see, I think. And I find that very interesting that Christmas trees, gifts, things like that, it's fun. People like decorating stuff. It's nice to have a tree in your house for like a bit. Like, it's not like a thing that most of us do often. I don't think. I mean, I know plants, but trees, I don't know if most people have trees in their house. But like inside the house, I mean. But yeah. But I don't even know what to say. I don't know how to end this, but hopefully that was interesting.